get started, what I wanted to ask you, Julie, to start out with is, obviously people just heard all these accolades about you and they hear the title and they hear all these incredible achievements that you've had. But what people don't really understand is the journey that it takes to get there. And they just see the perfection or the epitome of perfection from the titles. So can you talk a little bit about the background story of how you got to be where you are today?
First of all, thank you for making the distinction, because everybody sees a polished resume. All the stuff that goes on in the background. There are plenty of background stories. I guess just place to start, and I'm not going to give you my whole history, but I think it's kind of informative. When I was about to graduate from high school, and my mother had just died, so it was a pretty vulnerable time for me.
Wow.
I knew I wanted to go into business, and I went to my high school guidance counselor and said, help me, tell me what classes I need to take. I want to major in business. And literally his words to me, this was late 60s, were, no. Pretty little girls like you become bitches on wheels in business. You need to be a teacher. And I was very impressionable. And my mother had said for years as I was growing up, they'll always need teachers. So get a teaching credential. So I went to UCLA. I majored in English. I worked for an ad agency. I realized that my English degree, although I could argue absolutely it was the best foundational education I could have, but I wound up actually teaching junior high school for 2 years and realized it was like being in the Peace Corps. And I have the greatest admiration for teachers, but it wasn't my calling. So I went back and got my master's and then started in business. So that it was kind of a course correction. And what I sometimes say to young women when I get this question about, well, did you know every step you were going to take? If you're a skier, using this analogy, when you stand at the top of a mountain, you don't know which way you're going to go. You might go this way because you want to either take or avoid a mogul, or you want to go that way because you want to avoid a border or whatever. When you get down to the bottom, it looks like all your turns are linked. It looks like there was a plan. And that's the way I think life is. You look back at it and it looks like it's a plan. But at the time, you were just optimizing the situation. You were just making the very best of the choices you could make. And some choices were good, some choices aren't. But the idea was just to keep moving forward. So that's the origin story.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So I have to ask you, just as a follow-on to that, is so then how did you go about following those instincts? Because obviously you had instincts to go in a different direction. And it was hard because there's a lot of pressure of, no, you need to be doing this. People are putting you in a box. They're putting you in this pigeonhole, especially in the state of women at that time, right? What do you think it was about you that helped you?
Well,
frankly,
it just ticked me off when I was told I couldn't do something. And what I also say when I mentor young women is use a little bit of that frustration or anger, actually, to fuel you. Mm-hmm. Let it push you to do something you might not otherwise do. And I asked a wise woman one time, she could help me understand why I'd been successful. And I said, I think it's because I've worked my butt off. And she said, no, my observation is it's because you always said yes at the door. Mm-hmm. And I thought about that. And you think about the fact, headhunters will tell you that if there's a job description with 10 items, men will apply if they just have 3 of the requirements. Women won't apply unless they have 8 or 10. Yeah. So a little bit of that kind of bravado, I mean, not a personal affectation, but just a little bit internal bravery that helps you say yes at the door. Chances are it's not rocket science on the other side, and you can figure it out. And I think that's probably a little sense of adventure, I think, has probably helped me along. And I try to encourage that in women who are coming through. The best first story I can tell you is I just, freshly minted a graduate degree. And I happened to live in Atlanta at the time, and I was at a cocktail party and chatting with a banker. There was a bank then called Citizens and Southern, and they had all of this REO property, real estate owned property, where they had loaned, and then the developer went bankrupt because they didn't sell, and they had to take them back into the bank and resell them. And as he was describing it, there was a lot of money that had come into Atlanta, and there were a lot of high-rise condominiums, and the market was just oversaturated. And I thought, what an idiot. I mean, did you do any market research? How many buyers were there? And they were all the same. There was no sense of market segmentation whatsoever. Anyway, all this went through my head in a flash. And I said to him, well, it's so interesting you mentioned that, because I have a little market research firm that specializes in real estate. And he said, I guess he was desperate. He said, well, come in on Monday and we'll talk. So I went home that weekend and printed up business cards.
Oh my gosh.
And I thought, how this can't be rocket science. How hard can this be? So I went in and I spent 5 years in Atlanta teaching myself the real estate industry, just doing some basics. And what was happening is product segmentation, thinking back that far, had not hit housing. It was just hitting automobiles. The idea that if you build the same 4-bedroom house, you're only going to get one type of buyer. So we completely revamped the marketing. We changed the design. When they started doing the build outs, I worked with the architects. We actually gave them direction on what the market wanted. And it was a fabulous education. And then I wanted to move back to California, where I'm from. And when I came back, I remember calling up the man, lovely, Tom Nielsen was his name, who was the head of the Irvine company at the time. I didn't know him. Called him and said, I'm back. I'd love to sit down and talk with you. Could you just give me 15 minutes of your time? And I went in and talked to him. And what I found, another thing I say to young women is, ask people for their time. More often than not, they're very willing to give it. And they'll give you 15 minutes. It's flattering. They want to tell you their story. So Tom introduced me, all these years later, he's still a friend, introduced me to a number of people in the industry. And so I started working back here in California. About 5 years went by, and then there was a headhunter search. Headhunter contacted me, and they were looking for someone actually in Atlanta to run the division of Mobil Oil. I realized that probably they weren't going to find a lot of candidates with the description that they wanted. But the problem was I didn't want to go back to Atlanta at the time. So I called one of my banker friends and said, what do you do when you have a headhunter after you like this? And he said, well, you do a sun, moon, and stars contract. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, you throw everything but the kitchen sink in that you want. And now be careful with this, because if they should possibly, then you have to be prepared to go. So I thought about it for a while, and I thought, well, what would it take? And so I came up with this crazy, I wanted to be the highest paid woman in Atlanta. I wanted them to buy me a house. I wanted a country club membership. I wanted certain reporting relationships because of my son. I wanted a certain amount of time. I mean, it was just insane, but they accepted it. And I think, again, it was because there were very few people who had had the benefit of this kind of PhD in urban design and knew that market intimately. So I went back and spent 5 years, and it was terrific. And the lesson in this is A, saying yes at the door, being willing to do that, and B, being a little audacious, maybe sometimes. And I've never gotten myself into a situation that I didn't figure out how to handle eventually. And I think that's probably true for most people. And remind me to tell you my golf story, because that was the ultimate in saying I could do something and I couldn't.
Oh, well, no. So I'm going to remind you right now. So tell us the golf story. What's the golf story? So
the first board that I went on was, it became Anthem Insurance. And one of the board members there liked the work that I was doing. I wound up being the first woman on every board. And typically the guys would give me the comp committee. And I used to think, oh, they must think I'm very good at this. And what I realized is they didn't want to tell the CEO themselves that he couldn't have this outrageous salary. So, let the girl do it.
So let you do it. Right.
Let me do it. One of the people on the committee who liked the work I was doing and the way I was standing up to the CEO was a lovely man named William Bush. And he was the first President Bush's brother. And he was just generous, kind. He had the most lovely manners of anyone I've ever met. But he suggested that I interview for another board that he was on. And that's Lord Abbott in New York, which is a investment management company. And I said, that's not my field. I don't have a background for that. And he said, well, how much did you know about healthcare before you went on the WellPoint Anthem board? And I said, well, that's true. I suppose I could. I went to New York for the interview, and I prepared for all the questions I thought were the logical questions to ask me. Like, why do you think you could be a board member in the financial services industry? Which is a very, very fair question. So going into the interview, I should have seen this coming. It was at the Lynx Club in New York, which is on 62nd Upper East Side, old bastion of golf club. no women's restrooms above the first floor. So, you know, the kind of the milieu. And I'm in a dining room being interviewed by three white-haired gentlemen, lovely fireplace in the background, very, very genteel. And I'm prepared for my interview and I'm prepared for my questions. The only question they asked me, other than just chit chat, was, "You do play golf, don't you?" I mean, it's a classic, right? It's a cliche, but it ticked me off because it first of all, what does this have to do with being a fiduciary, right? And secondly, what I wanted to say is, yes, I'm female, I have a child, I'm a CEO, and I spent all my afternoons playing golf. So I have an exquisite game. What came out of my mouth was, of course I do, you know, and then I tried to change the subject. The interview went on. I called my husband on the way home. He said, "How did you do?" And I said, "I think they liked me, but I've got a problem." I said, "I lied about playing golf." And he said, "How long do you have to learn?" And I said, "Well, I have 6 months because they want me to go with them to Augusta National." We got there and we were going to play 18 holes the first afternoon, 36 holes the second day, and 18 holes on the morning that we were leaving. I mean, just an insane amount of opportunities to make a fool of myself. So we walked in at lunchtime and I followed the guys in, and you're the guest of three coats, and walked into this smaller dining room with our three hosts and my group. And the first thing the man at the head of the table says is, "Mr. Bush, could you please take Mrs. Hill into the family dining room?" So I realized I've walked into, you know, part of the male sanctuary.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah. So I stand up and I think, okay, you know, I'm not even barely on the grounds and I've tripped a wire. So Bucky William Bush stands up and he says, "Of course, I'll take Mrs. Hill into that dining room." Well, then this man at the head of the table, who is one of our hosts, stands up and says, "Hold on, just a moment. Let me do something." And he walks in another room. So first learning about Augusta, some members are greater than other members, you know, in their hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes back and he says, "No, I'd like you to stay, please. And I'm going to change the order of play and you'll be my partner." So, okay. So this guy turns out to be, his name was Max Taylor. It was Taylor Made Golf. I mean, like a golf family. And at the end of the lunch, he says, "Would you like to have a tour of Augusta? I'll tell the guys to go, you know, start warming up and we'll have a tour." So he puts me in his cart and we go into the Eagle's Nest. We go into the clubhouse. He shows me Tiger Woods' locker. And then I realize, if Max likes me, I'm going to be golden here, because all of the guys love this guy, kind of genuflect up to him, to his leadership. And I think, you know, God saved me a little pass card here. So we played and played and played and played and played. And it was so much fun. I really had a ball, but it was because I had someone who was looking out for me.
Right. It was like a sponsor, really. And
He was definitely a sponsor.
yeah.
Just one last little anecdote. On the very first day, so it was probably 3 p.m, and the drinks cart comes around, and the man says, "Mr. Taylor, will you have your usual?" And he says, "Yes, please." So he gets this drink, and it looks like lemonade, and it's put in the cup holder, and it reeks of alcohol. It's not lemonade. It's vodka and lemonade. So being a little cheeky, I say to the man, "I'll have what he's having." And so we tootled around the golf course drinking our vodka and lemonade and just giggled and laughed. And it was a lifetime experience.
Wow.
I still didn't play very well, but I got away with it.
What a story. I mean, there's so many gems in what you just described in that story, right? And so I could unpack this. One of the things I want to ask you is, there's a boldness to all of these things that you're describing. There's a self-assurance piece of that. And what I find in working in the work that I do is that what prevents us often of doing these things are these like rampant feelings of, I'm an imposter, people don't, you know, I don't belong here. Also, not only that, but also just the self-doubt that just goes through the head. I mean, then there's stories of very, very successful women who talk about that, talk about having those feelings. So what about you? So it doesn't sound like that is part of your repertoire in your mind.
Oh,
So
oh, no,
talk a little bit about that.
yeah. No,
Yeah.
I think that's a real thing.
Yeah.
As I said, on the plane on the way down, I was terrified, literally terrified, worried that that first drive I would muffle and it would be revealed, that I was an imposter, that I didn't have any right to be there.
And in some case, I mean, so not to belittle your story, but in some case you were an imposter when it came
I
to
was. I
right.
was. No, it was a bold-faced lie. I
At
mean,
least the golf was,
I totally copped to that. And maybe it was just my morality at the time, but there were so many barriers to entry for women. And I thought, if this is what it takes, I'm going to chutzpah this thing out.
Right.
It wasn't until that first sip of vodka that I thought, oh, this might work. Because I actually scared myself to death. And all those feelings of imposter are there. They're definitely there. I think we all humans feel that. But a couple of thoughts. I have always believed that if I ever wrote a book, what I would put at the top, at the beginning, or on the frontispiece would be, life is a script we wrote before. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, then I want to write a really good script. And if that means taking chances in order to walk through the door that might otherwise be closed to me, then I would do that. And what I finally realized in later years is I was entertaining myself. I was testing myself to see how far I could go. It's not that I didn't have those feelings. I absolutely did. Every time I would get up to give a speech, I would think, why would they want to listen to me? This is kind of the way I was thinking at the time. I was terrified to jump out of an airplane. So I signed up for one of those tandem jumps just to see if I could do that. And I mean, I didn't jump on my own, obviously, but this was in Australia. I walked into a rec center. There was a video running showing that you could do this without, in the US, you have to do 3 days of training before you could even do a tandem jump, I think. But here you could just walk out on the airfield the next day and do it. So I signed up. And as we had a tiny little plane, no door on one side. And I'm thinking, it's a perfectly good plane. Why would I jump out of that plane? On the way up, I said to the man who I was going to jump with, how do you handle fear the first time? And he gave me a really interesting analogy. He said, fear is really just a chemical reaction. It's an adrenaline rush. And he said, maybe just let that adrenaline run out your hands and your feet. I thought that was a metaphor for some of the things that I had done, that I actually didn't think would kill me, but I wanted to see if I could do it. So there's a little bit of adventurism in there. There's a little bit of, I actually think, this goes a little deeper, but I actually think my mother's death early on in my life made me want to savor every minute. Long story about her. She was one of 7 Swedish immigrants, very, very poor, the only one to go to college, graduated from high school when she was 15. She was valedictorian, full ride scholarship to college. But then her career was aborted because she was the only one in the family who was not earning an income and returning money to the family when her father became very ill. And so she had to leave college and come home to care for him. She's the only one who wasn't working. And that stunted her life. It stopped where she could have gone. I think she could have done anything. So I think without being conscious about this, I probably do a lot of things because she couldn't.
Yes. No, there's definitely something there. And it's what a poignant story. I mean, I resonate with that as well. My father died right before his 60th birthday. And it just, I don't know how old I was at the time, but I was in my 30s. And I just remember that just turned a switch in my head of, now I just want to do all these things that I want to squeeze it all out. So yeah. I totally relate to that. But it's interesting how we wait for those types of experiences to wake us up. Mm-hmm. I call them thunderbolts. Whereas what you're saying is, there's one life, squeeze it out. I mean, I think that's really what you're saying.
Exactly. And, I've thought about this many, many times over the years. It was a blessing and a curse that my mother died that early. I had my epiphany, my jolt very quickly, that if I'm going to have a good life, I'm going to need to do this myself. I'm going to need to figure this out. And somebody said to me one time, what would your motto be? And I said, well, a lot of it has to be say yes at the door, but also just keep moving forward. And I had a wise woman say to me one time, I was at a point of a dilemma. And she said, you know, when you're in a situation like this, just do the next indicated thing. And many times that helped me a lot when I couldn't see, couldn't see the forest for the trees, or I couldn't see the bottom of the ski slope. I just took the next step.
Take the next step. I think sometimes we get overwhelmed by the magnitude of something. And I think that is such a wise thing. And, I tell my clients that all the time, is that one step at a time, and then it brings you forward. And where people paralyze and they do nothing because they see the whole thing. I mean, it's, so let me ask you this. We talk a lot about success, and you talked a lot about success and how to be successful. What about failure? So it's not possible that throughout, and however you view failure, right? Because that's another piece of it. But it can't be possible that everything you did or you touched turned into gold.
Absolutely.
So describe perhaps a failure that you had, and then how do you learn from that and overcome that? That's what trips people up.
Yeah, that old thing in dating is you kiss a lot of frogs. You can do the same thing with companies that you work for.
Right.
Two things. One from the earlier part of my career when I was an executive, and then one about a board that I went on that I regretted. The very first corporate job that I had was in Atlanta. And it was a real estate development company, early days. This is before I decided I was going to start my own. And I had not been in that industry, and I didn't realize how precarious it could be. They were going to do layoffs. They had to do layoffs. And he had an organizational chart, and I can still see it to this day. And the blue squares were people who were going to be laid off in 2 weeks. And my job was to tell them that they were not going to be laid off, that they were going to stay, because they were concerned that the layoffs they were doing that day would spread fear, even though they knew it was a two-part situation. And my job was to go around and tell these people that not to worry, layoffs will happen today, but your job is secure. And specifically tell the people that they knew were going in 2 weeks. And I remember saying to this guy, I won't do that. And he said, why? And I said, well, for obvious reasons. First, it's a lie. Secondly, nobody who then is not laid off will trust you. I mean, I don't know who thought of this, but this is
strategy, right?
This is just bad strategy, and I don't want any part of it. And he said, I need to talk to the CEO, and if I don't think that you have any usefulness here, if you're not going to do this. And I thought, well, I probably don't. So I'm in his office. He leaves. He's going to go down and talk to the CEO to figure out what to do about this recalcitrant rebel who's not going to do his dirty work for him.
Insubordinate.
And in that period of time, a young woman that I'd gotten to know ducks her head in, and she said, is everything all right in here? And I said, well, not actually. And she said, well, a lot of people are saying that they're going to be layoffs today. And I said, that's right. And there'll be another wave in 2 weeks. And she said, thank you for telling me. She said, am I one of them? And I said, yes, you are one of them. So the guy named Tom comes back and says to me, the CEO and I agree that your usefulness here is over. And I said, great, good. I'm leaving. I'm out of here. And on the way out, because he basically said, get your things and leave. On the way out, I said to as many people as I could, you're a blue square. You're a blue square.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that is so funny.
Right. Well, it was, and it wasn't. It was a lesson that kind of things can happen. I remember thinking, my God, I just gave up a good job. And at that time, I needed to work. I needed to make some money, but I knew I couldn't do that. And I think I never really liked this guy when I interviewed with him to begin with.
Yeah. So
and my mistake was I didn't trust that. I didn't trust that. So I got in deeper than I wanted to get in. And then I was asked to do something unethical, and I left. That's the one that stands out to me the most, because it was early in my career. I spent a week thinking, oh no, what have I done? But one of the things I do say to young women is you listen to your gut.
So Julie, I just want to stop there for a second, because I think it's important to put an exclamation point on that, because I think there's something about, what are your non-negotiables in what you talked about? And what that sounds like is your integrity is a non-negotiable. And so whether it's going to turn into a perceived failure or not, it's defining what those non-negotiables are. And you kind of had that compass right there.
Well, and part of what went through my mind was, what kind of recommendations is this guy going to give for next time? Because he's certainly not going to fess up to the fact that he was asking me to lie.
Right. Right.
And that was an industry that I was interested in. Sadly for them, they eventually went bankrupt. So it wasn't as if it was an entity that was thriving and, you know,
Right.
spew out recommendations or bad recommendations for me. So
There's sometimes these things, and without sounding new agey, I do believe there's sometimes these things happen as they're moving you forward. And so that step, if you had stayed there, that would have changed the trajectory of your career. So some of these choices that you're making along the way actually impact some of the other choices.
So let's get real new agey, because
Okay.
I absolutely believe, I mean, I'm the one that said life is a script we wrote before.
Yeah. I believe that too, by the way. So
yeah. So we don't know how that works, right? It's still a mystery to
right.
us. But I have always believed along the way that synchronicities that are way out of the odds of just coincidence. First of all, they're very personal. They have to happen to you to fully understand them. When you try to describe them to someone else, it loses its intensity and its profundity. But those synchronicities have been guideposts for me along the way when you start thinking about it. And I actually had a conversation about a week ago with a man who's an astrophysicist. He said, "How did you make that decision?" And I said, "Well, it was a very synchronicity type of event for me." And he said, "Tell me more about synchronicity." And I said, "Well, it's Jung's concept of meaningful coincidences." And he said, "Why do you believe in that?" And I said, "Because it's happened to me and I've experienced it. And it's a universal thing, I think, if you're paying attention." And he said, "Do you know Niels Bohr?" And I said, so Niels Bohr is a physicist. And I actually had read as much as I could comprehend of a book that he wrote. And what he was saying is that he debated with Einstein. Niels Bohr said that something that happens on this part of the world will affect something that happens on this part of the world. And that there's a force that we don't have a name for, we haven't identified yet, but he said it exists and it's there. And if that can be true, then synchronicities, I believe, can be true. So this astrophysicist was explaining to me, he said, "I think when we get to AI 14 and we have a algorithm for this and we've proven it," he said, "it will all come back to your synchronicity."
Yeah.
It'll all come back to that. So I thought, okay, this new agey stuff, we're onto something. We sense it, we intuit it, and it serves you if you're paying attention.
I can't tell you how much I agree with that, Julie. Actually, two of my last episodes, I interviewed this man named Joseph Jaworski. And I don't know if
I can't believe you're telling me about Joe Jaworski.
I just interviewed him on the podcast. I did, and he's 88 years old. And he wrote the book Synchronicity, the Inner Path
Path of
Leadership.
Leadership.
Yeah.
He wrote that in the 90s.
Yes. Which changed my life when I read that book.
Me too.
Oh,
Me too. So much so, I chaired the CEO roundtable at UCI at the time. I called him up. I said, "I'm doing a retreat in Hawaii. You must come and speak."
Oh my goodness.
Flew him out. I've wondered what happened. That book sits right over there.
Yeah. No.
In his organization that I got to know. Absolutely.
Right. And so he interviewed David Bohm, who was, talked about quantum theory. And basically a lot of, and then he also wrote this book recently called The Source, which is where the source of all knowledge comes from. And we had this conversation in depth about synchronicity and the source of all knowledge, and how we as leaders are using so much of the part of our brain that doesn't really understand these things. We shut this out, where this is reality. There is something really big about this. And so when I said new agey, I say that because I think people think that some of these ideas are new agey, but I find that there's enough evidence out there. It's just we really can't comprehend it. So it's such a coincidence. There you go, a meaningful
There,
coincidence. I just
there you
spoke
go.
to him like last month, and we
I
did a
would,
two-part interview series.
first of all, I'm happy to know he's still alive. It was 20 years ago
Yeah,
when
he's
I met him,
88, and
and he's still doing, I would love to see his podcast.
yeah.
Absolutely. Synchronistically, unbelievably, there was a young woman named Margaret Vaughn who worked with him in his institute at the time that I got to be very, very good friends with. And we went our separate ways. I hadn't seen her probably in 10 years. She just literally last week caught up with me on LinkedIn and emailed me, and we had a fabulous reunion conversation. So Jaworski's coming back into my life.
There's
You,
a reason for this, right?
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my gosh. Anyway, what a strange coincidence. But when you mention synchronicity, I always think of Joe Jaworski and David Bohm, and then we go back to Carl Jung and all of that.
Two things. It relates to me to flow.
Yes.
When you are in flow, because you're channeling something different. And there was a fellow named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi who wrote the book Flow. Okay, it was a dense scientific book that reduced something magical to science. The second thing is my brother actually is a rocket scientist. I gave him a t-shirt for Christmas once that said, actually, yes, I am a rocket scientist. And when I talk to him about these things, I would think his mind is very different than mine, obviously. When I talk to him about this, his reaction is not, oh, that's airy fairy. His reaction is magic is simply an insufficiently explained phenomenon. So synchronicity appears like magic because we can't explain it, because we don't have the tools. We don't understand it. We intuit it. We feel it. That's why when someone asked me, did you have any guides as a leader when you became a CEO? And it just came to me because I was on the board of the Orange County Community Foundation. And what I realized they were doing, they were stewarding funds for not-for-profit, for philanthropic donations. And so I said to them, you have the best of the head and the heart. You have to have the financial acumen, but you also have to have the heart for the cause. And I think that stuck with me about a way to manage is you have to get the basics. You have to have the tools, but the heart will lead you into places that you can't necessarily explain linearly. Anyway, so yes, I think we're onto something. And if all we did was legitimize this, and particularly for women, have you ever read Gary Zukav's book, The Seat of the Soul?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Oprah made it one of her books, and I wanted to say, Oprah, I read this 10 years ago.
Exactly. So did I, by the way. I read it way before Oprah had made it big.
Okay, so I
was very into those books, including Joe, and then yes,
we're on similar paths, absolutely. Yep. But what it said, if you remember, was Zukov said that he believes intuition is just a higher order of thinking, and that women, because of our women's intuition, are kind of evolving faster on that. But if you think about that in business, that's tricky at this phase, because mostly it's the men still who are leading, who are the CEOs, who are the board members. And that kind of thinking is still misto frico to them, right? And I can tell you on my mutual fund board that I'm still on, there are times when one of the guys will say, how did you figure that out? I mean, how did you know that? And I said, I just knew it. It just came to me. I just knew it. And so that gets invalidated. If I hadn't been on that board for 15 years and been right, enough. But I think the same wise woman said to me, do you realize you chose to come in at this time to midwife a new consciousness with a number of other people and other women? And I think that is what we're doing, is that we're helping to bring that forth. And, I would never.
I love that phrase. I mean, what you just said speaks so much to the conversations I've been having recently, is this whole midwifing of a new consciousness, because it's so related, Julie. Another guest that I just recently had was Lisa Leahy, who's a guru in human development. And, one of the premises in theories of human development are the ways we make meaning, right? And so we start out with an expert consciousness of, we're the expert, and then we move forward. But then there's a point in time, and there's a very few amount of people who have reached this so far, where meaning comes from all different sources. It's not just coming from our own ego. And so I think that's part of the things that we're talking about, is tapping into something different and bigger that we don't even understand, and we don't even know where that's coming from.
So I have a book for you.
Yeah.
It's called Braiding Sweetgrass.
What is it called? Braiding Sweetgrass.
Yeah, funny title, Braiding Sweetgrass.
All right.
This partially comes out of the work I've been doing for the environment. This is a woman who, she's an indigenous woman, grew up on a reservation, went to college, became a botanist, became a PhD. As she says in the book, I could tell you at least 2,000 Latin terms for plants. And she said, but I didn't really get to know plants through my head, through my intellect. I knew more about them when I was a child on the reservation, lying in a field watching the white strawberries turn to red. So she went back, and this book is about her journey, and she will describe nature to you in a way that will open your mind. It is lyrical. She's a poet. She's a scientist.
Yeah.
She's an excellent writer. It will bring you back into the wisdom of nature. And I mean, you've heard of the book, The Secret Life of Trees. Do you know that every tree in the forest is connected?
Yeah. Oh, I know. Oh, I spend time in those redwood forests, and it's just amazing. But they're connected
Fabulous.
underneath, right? They water each other. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yes. And they decide who can live and who
Yes, it's great.
It's incredible. So my point with all of this is there's a whole other consciousness around us if we turn into it. And that wisdom, I think, is there if we suspend it's a willing suspension of disbelief. I think Coleridge said that.
Yeah.
A willing suspension of disbelief. So to take meaning from so many different things, I am excited for you to read that book.
Oh, I will. I mean, this is what I think in the work that I'm doing on some level is what I'm trying to do, and trying to move beyond the rational and try to at least open the windows a little bit for people to see that there is another world. And talking to people like yourself who understand and also have experienced this, it makes it more tangible for people, because I think
tangible is a good word. And it's also, I've read a lot lately about the connection between awe and joy. And when you watch this happen, when it unfolds in a way that your conscious, literate mind, literal mind could not make up, the awe of that, the joy of that, it can almost make you giddy. And thank you for this conversation, because that is as close as I've ever been able to explain about why I've taken the chances that I have. Yeah. The book after Zhukov's first book was called The Dancing Ruling Masters. Okay. That's what I think about sometimes when I'm out on this high wire doing something like Augusta, the dancing ruling masters. It's dancing with this, dancing with flow, dancing with synchronicity, dancing with whatever that other force out there is that I can access, that will come in and create a situation that I could never have made up.
Yeah. And I know exactly what you mean. I had this conversation. I asked Joseph Jaworski when I talked to him, I said, so how do you tap into this source? And the things that he mentioned, right, which I think you will, and I'm going to restate this for everyone because I think it was so powerful and it relates to what we're talking about, is he said, beginner's mind, obviously, letting go of the judgment. He said nature, being in nature. And then the last thing he said was love.
Yep.
And so there it was. And so when I asked him, what's the one thing that people can do to be better leaders? He said, focus on love. And that is, so there it is. I mean, I think we're talking about the same things, and yet it's hard to quantify or make this tangible. And how do you practice this as a leader on a daily basis? But I think it's about what I am so adamant about, that it's not so much all about what you're doing. It's about who you're being while you're doing it. And I think that's really what we're talking about here, Julie.
Yeah.
On some level.
And it's a gift.
Self-mastery.
It is, and it's a gift to get to the point where that part of the world opens up to you. And I think about this. I'm the kind of person who gets a lump in her throat at the Olympics, right? Because I just think humankind is so incredible. This to me is where awe is love, joy is love. The way you interact with human beings is love. And that power, we've got a kind of a little word for an incredibly powerful force. I'm thinking of the Beatles, love is all there is. So, it's just so refreshing to talk to you about this. I had no idea we would go in this.
Neither did I, but that's where we were meant to go.
Yes, so, exactly. And it's incredibly refreshing.
Yeah. Anyway, what a synchronistic meeting that we had today.
This is the definition of it, isn't
it?
Right?
I don't think you can embody it any differently than our conversation. So I can't tell you how refreshing this conversation was. And also, I have to say, I feel I can see, because I can see you. Some people are watching the video, some people are listening to the podcast, but I can see your face changed and your whole being changed. And when we started talking in this way, it's like it lightened up. And so I think, it's amazing. I think there's like the spirit came out, or the spirit of Julie came out. So I thank you so much for spending time with me today and talking about this. I'm going to ask you, just in the way our conversation went, what final words of wisdom would you like to offer on this whole notion? Because we really are talking about the type of leadership that we need going forward, when you really think about it, and the type of humans we need in the world to be able to hold this. And it is a higher consciousness. So what would you say, Julie, just from off the top of your head, to kind of round this out today?
How would you act if you knew it was all going to be okay? Because it is all going to be okay. You believe in a benevolent or malevolent universe. And I think believing in a benevolent universe allows you to play maybe in the way that I did. And thank you for this. This is kind of the evolution for me. What I realized is I was playing at Augusta. I was playing with what's the worst that could happen. Can I dance through that? Can I make that happen? So imagining the worst outcome and still doing what you're going to do, still doing what you think is right, is, to me, you're playing with the universe. You're playing with good and bad, light and dark. You're playing with your own human potential, and you get into flow, and then you find the joy there, and you find that you can dance on that high wire.
Yes, I'm teared up listening to you. So thank you so much, my wise woman, for your wisdom today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to know you. And let's go have a glass of wine and talk about this more.